Girls' education as a climate linchpin. Educating girls is, of course, transformational. It changes their lives, their families, and the communities and economies that they live in. And it has a lasting impact on climate action and climate justice. So how can funders, governments, and businesses collaborate to transform girls' access to education around the world? To lead this discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Francesca Donna, who is executive editor of Quartz at Work and previously the gender director of In Her Words at the New York Times. Please welcome Francesca Donna and her speakers.
Hello. Well, I know you might be thinking about lunch because it's coming up soon, but please don't. Just for the next 35 minutes, we're going to talk about climate, education, girls, leadership. So last night, when I was thinking about the questions that I was going to ask my wonderful panelists, and I can't wait to introduce them to you, I wrote a little introduction about climate and leadership and girls and all the things that I mentioned just now, and I was thinking back over the week of the Women's Global Forum and how amazing it's been. And there's been so many buzzwords. There have been words like activism and leadership and inclusion, diversity, power and purpose, Sophie's favorite words, I think. And I thought about all of those words, and I think they're amazing words. I love them. But they also gave me pause, because here's the thing. It's really easy to say the words and say what people want to hear when you're in the spotlight and you're on this wonderful stage and you're in the Carrousel du Louvre and one of the most amazing places in all of France. But then I started asking myself, what happens when the lights go down and the media goes home and the front page of the New York Times gets swept into the next day's recycling? And then I really wonder, what are we left with? Because that's when the work begins. That's hard work. And I think hard work is what happens when nobody's watching. Hard work is what happens when you're ready for bed, but you push on anyway. And hard work is what happens when you're not comfortable, but you do it because you have to. Right before this panel, I noticed that Vanessa, who I will introduce in a moment, was sitting in the audience. She's about to come on stage. It's sort of a big deal to me to be on stage, and maybe to her, I don't know. But she was quietly sitting there in the dark, preparing her poster demanding climate justice. And that is hard work. And so while we might throw around these buzzwords and talk about how important it is to be inclusive and have power and determination and all of these things, at the end of the day, what really matters after we all go home is hard work. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists. They're amazing. I know they all know a lot about hard work. And they're also a truly global panel. They hail from 3 continents, and with me included, that actually makes 4 continents, and I think that's appropriate for this discussion that we're about to have. So, Vanessa Nakate, here next to me on the stage, is the founder of the Green Schools Project and Rise Up Movement Africa. We are so, 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 so happy to have you here in person. Thank you. My next panelist on the screen behind me is Kate Hampton. She is the CEO of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Thank you for being here. And last but not least, we have Lily Kong. who is in Singapore. Thank you for being here. I don't even know what time it is for you. Thank you. She is the president of Singapore Management University. It's fantastic to have you. So,
thank you.
We're going to get right into it, okay? We're going to talk about climate and girls and leadership and all the buzzwords. I'm going for it. So, Kate, I'd actually like to begin with you. I want to just start with some basics. We so often hear, and I know we've heard today countless times, that climate is a gender issue. And I'd like you to explain for audience, even though maybe they know, but maybe they don't, how does that manifest from where you're sitting? What does that really look like, and what does that really mean?
Thanks. I mean, from where I'm sitting, just as an individual, I started climate campaigning at the age of 12, actually. So, you know, I think you can see the extraordinary leadership of young women and girls throughout the many decades of the climate crisis, and especially now. The climate movement is being led in many ways by women and young women and girls. So I think that's the first point to note, that some of the outstanding breakthroughs that we've seen politically have their origins in the activism and hard work, as you say, of women and girls. It's a huge privilege to take part in this forum and with this panel. And I saw Vanessa speak at COP26, where we both were a couple of weeks ago. I run an organization which is a philanthropy, the largest philanthropy focused on the well-being of children. And we put gender and climate at the forefront of our work. And usually when people hear Children's Foundation, they go, well, why are you working on gender generally and climate? They expect us to be working on little kids' problems, I guess. But these two issues share something very important, which is they are systemic issues. Climate touches everything and gender touches everything. And if we can really make progress in gender equality, we can break the intergenerational cycle of poverty that traps so many children in spaces where they can't achieve their full potential. And if we tackle the climate crisis, we will not only prevent the worst impacts, we will also unleash a huge amount of creativity and political change. And if you bring those two things together, coming out of COVID, where we've seen a massive dislocation between the poorest and the richest in the world, where many of the indicators for childhood and for women have been going backwards instead of forwards. Working on gender equality and climate change together would be the greatest propellers for taking us out of this crisis. They are huge force multipliers. A green, resilient, inclusive economy with gender equality at the forefront that's really focused on helping this generation of girls be educated and lead. This would be a world that I want to live in, and I want to.
Thank you so much. I want to stick. You know, look, the theme of this panel is education and girls. So we're going to keep going back and back to it. So I want to stick with that. And Vanessa, if I may, you founded the Green Schools Project. And I'm wondering if you can talk us through, or talk our audience through, this connection between education and climate activism, and what that looks like specifically at the organization that you founded.
Thank you so much. The Green Schools project involves the installation of solar panels and eco-friendly cook stoves in schools in Uganda, and it is to help drive a transition to renewable energy and for schools to be able to have stoves that can reduce on the amount of firewood that they use for preparation of food, and they create a smooth learning process for students in schools. And I would like to specifically talk about the education of girls and climate justice. From the previous question, the climate crisis exacerbates already existing inequalities that many girls and many young women face across the world. And we know in certain societies, women and girls have been given the roles of providing food for their families, collecting water for their families. So they are at the front lines of the climate crisis when these disasters happen. They are the ones on the farms when the crops are dried up. They are the ones on the farms when the farms are washed away. They are the ones to walk long distances to collect water for their families. Many girls face a challenge of dropping out of school as their families lose their ability to take care of their school expenses. Many girls face a risk of being forced into early marriages. So as the climate crisis, as the global temperatures rise, the inequalities against so many girls and women are increased. So the climate crisis will mean dropping out of school of so many girls. It will mean forced marriages for so many girls. It will mean, I'm looking for the word, destroyed futures for so many girls and so many women. It will mean women walking very long distances to look, for water, like I've said. So I think that when we talk about climate justice, we have to talk about gender justice. There is no climate justice without gender justice. That's why I think it's really important to have more girls educated, to have more women empowered. Education of girls is way more effective than many climate solutions that we think about, that we first think about when we talk about climate solutions. Project Drawdown lists 100 things that we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and ranked number 5 as the most impactful solution is educating girls and family planning. So this is a solution that is going to reduce already existing inequalities, a solution that is going to build resilience of individuals, resilience of families and communities, a solution that is going to reduce greenhouse gases all at the same time. So in the end, education of girls and women empowerment will give all of us a lifeline. It will give the women and girls gender justice, and it will give all of us climate justice. So that's why the sign I made today, it says, I'll show you, climate justice equals gender justice, and we cannot talk about the climate crisis without talking about how it impacts the lives of so many women and so many girls across the world. So climate justice equals gender justice.
Thank you. I want to just make the sort of next step in the connection in what you said, and I can see that it's so clear that unpaid labor, things like walking to get water, cooking, preparing meals, farming, all of these things when the food is less and less and the money is more scarce, is really such a terrible blocker, and it can prevent economic advancement. It can also prevent people from going to school because they have to help more because the situation is more drastic. What I would love to also understand from you is the purpose of education. Of course, we do it because it's the right thing to do. We do it because it's fair. We do it because girls should have an education too. But when a girl is given an education, what does that mean? What does that empower her to do?
When a girl is given education, we all get a lifeline. The whole world is given a lifeline. The fact is that the world cannot move smoothly when girls are not in school. I also had to mention a point that I forgot in the previous. When you look at the communities that are not responsible for the climate crisis, they're still the same communities whereby girls are not going to school or girls are not able to finish school. So these are some of the horrible realities of the climate crisis and education. So I think when more girls are educated, it gives all of us a lifeline. It gives many girls the empowerment, the tools they need for research. I had no idea about the climate crisis. I learned about climate change in geography, but I didn't know about how much of an impact it was. But because I got an education, I knew how to do research. I knew how to look, to find out the challenges that people were facing in my community. I knew how to use the phone. I knew how to use the internet. I knew how to understand the things I was reading, and that is what led me to become, an activist. And all the articles I've been reading, all the things I've been learning from other activists, it has been because I was able to get an education which helped me have an understanding of everything that I was reading. So I think in the end, like I said, the girl will be benefited, the woman will benefit as well, but it won't just end there. This impact will go beyond the individual. It will go to her family, it will go to her community, and it will eventually go to the entire world.
Thank you. Thank you. Lily, in Singapore, you are in an educational institution, a great one. And look, data show women consistently getting college degrees in higher numbers than men. But one only needs to look at COP26 as an example to see that the trend just doesn't hold in terms of who goes on to make it to the table, get their voice heard, who secures the leadership positions. We know in this room that women are a really critical part of the climate solution, yet consistently they are routinely left out of the conversation. I'm really curious to hear from you what you think can be done at the university level to propel women after graduation.
I think that's a great question. So first I want to agree very much with Kate and Vanessa on what they've said about the disproportionate impact of climate change on girls and women. And data shows that very clearly. I'm not going to deny it. I also think that as a consequence, women can actually make a disproportionate impact of climate change if we're only able to include them at the table. And as Vanessa and Kate have eloquently said, education is a very key part of that. What can we do in education? How can we bring women to the table? I am concerned that in a lot of the issues to do with climate change, of course, STEM disciplines are not the only contributors, but they are important major contributors. And you just need to look at the proportion of women who go into STEM education versus the proportion of men who go into STEM education. How do we begin to increase the proportion of women in STEM education so that we enable their participation in a green economy? How can they contribute to and thrive in the green economy? How do we empower them for leadership? That requires that they are at the table, educated, not just in STEM disciplines, but definitely in that as well. So you do find, for example, that female students and employees are underrepresented in STEM-related fields. On average, around 30% of the world's researchers are women. And what that means is that women's insights and experiences are not brought to bear in STEM education because women are not getting that kind of education as much. I think very critically, not just in STEM education, in the context of my own institution in my own country, there is a terrible sort of need for greater innovation, for new ideas to cope with climate change, to address issues of climate change. And women are not nearly enough those entrepreneurs coming forward with the innovative ideas, not because they don't have the ideas, but very often because there are structural barriers to women in entrepreneurship. So when I think about education, I'm thinking not just in terms of what disciplines and what subjects might, we avail women to. How do we encourage more women into certain disciplines and so forth? How do we develop role models for them? But I'm also thinking about other kinds of education, like entrepreneurship education, like mentorship, so that women can actually make a difference. You know, women entrepreneurs, I think, understand well consumption decisions. After all, women make up at least 70% of consumption decisions. So women need, I think, to be involved in innovation and entrepreneurship that responds to consumption decisions. Women entrepreneurs inspire other women. Women entrepreneurs create job opportunities that benefit other women. And studies have shown that women are much more likely to innovate for social needs, men much more likely to innovate for profit. Studies have also shown that women are much more likely to believe that ESG investing does not compromise returns. So this other dimension of education in entrepreneurship, I think, is as important as the sort of education in particular disciplinary areas that we can and must encourage women into. So in all these different ways, I think educational institutions play a role, but so too do corporates play a role, so too do governments play a role in setting up that entrepreneurship ecosystem, in encouraging women, in removing some of the structural barriers to women entering into these areas.
That's really great points. Thank you. Kate, if I may, I wonder if I can sort of kick this idea to you for a little bit. I'm going to challenge you here. Don't be mad at me. To make the case for climate and female leadership specifically. I'm curious, would you say that women are the guardians of our climate future? If so, why? And what does that mean for men? And if not, then what enhanced role exactly do women have to play? I can see your face. You're like, I can't believe you did that. But over to you, Kate. Have fun.
Thanks. I mean, that's about several questions in one, so I'll do my best. I think I want to build on what Lillian and Vanessa have said. So there are two dimensions to this. One is, as Vanessa was saying, because women and girls are the most impacted, and we have to remember every fraction of a degree matters, because we're talking about hundreds of millions of people impacted with every fraction of degree, and it's the difference, as Vanessa was saying, between a girl being married as a child versus pursuing her education and making a huge contribution to society, let alone her own fulfillment. Because women are the most impacted, to Lily's point, they need to be designing the solutions. Otherwise, we won't be designing solutions that address the problem that we're causing. That's number one. But I think number two, there's a dimension of leadership which goes beyond dealing with impacts. We also need to see women's leadership in fields STEM, as we said, which is about basically reducing emissions through technology, but also dealing with many of the infrastructural challenges and other challenges around scientific challenges around the impacts. But there's also other disciplines, economics. Women are woefully underrepresented in economics, and yet the models that are run in the ministries of finance around the world are some of the biggest barriers to systemic change. It's always the Ministry of Finance that says no, and it's because the general equilibrium models are poorly designed and they don't reflect the complexity of innovation or indeed people's behavior. So we need more women in those positions of leadership, designing solutions, whether they be practical solutions around impacts or indeed theoretical solutions, policy solutions, decision-making at the highest level. So I think women's leadership is about actually being effective. Without women's leadership, multidisciplinary and at every level of society, local level, community level, all the way up to heads of state, parliaments, executive management, we won't actually solve this problem. So I think it's absolutely crucial. What does that mean for men? Allyship, I think, is crucial. There are a growing number of men who recognize the importance of women's leadership and are supporting women in their careers to achieve share of voice. But still, only 15% of environment ministries are led by women around the world. And we saw in COP26 the paucity of gender balance in the negotiations. And it required a real effort to fight on every panel for effective representation by women. So I think we need an effort on women's leadership in the fields that have an impact on climate change and are impacted by climate change, which is pretty much everything: medicine, management, leadership, economics, and so on. But we also need to make sure that there is agency for women at every level of decision making. When Vanessa talked about women being the ones that have to face desertification in the fields where they work, it is women who are planting trees along the Great Green Wall. It is smallholder farmers and women in communities who are doing the hard work of holding back the desert. So with agency at every level, women can design solutions that work for them, but they are the ones that are going to solve the problem. It is smallholders are predominantly women. It is smallholders who are predominantly impacted. We need to ensure that they have agency and access to finance and access to decision making. And I think it's really important that men are strong allies of women's leadership in the climate fight. So we as a philanthropy are really looking at supporting youth and women's leadership in climate decision making. It's not easy because philanthropy suffers from all the structural inequalities and barriers that society does. We embody them, and so we have to militate against them in order to ensure that power and resources is supporting climate justice. So I don't know if that answers your question. I hope that somewhat answers your question. I'm sure Lillian and Vanessa will have other things to say.
You got an A. Well done. Vanessa, I want to bring it back to you. And we're going to keep building on this same theme. So I'm sorry to bring it back to COP26 again, but you criticize those flying into Glasgow on private jets and making fancy speeches. And arguably, in my mind, a lot of the work was happening outside the gates in the form of protests and signs and raised voices. And too often, as we've heard, and as I'm sure you know, the voices are tolerated up until it comes time to do real business. And then those voices are shoved out of the way. And I'd like to ask you, how do we put those voices front and center? And what happens if we don't?
The voices on the streets?
Yeah.
Yeah, at the COP, to me personally, I saw that real change was what was happening on the streets.
Yeah.
With so many people protesting and demanding for climate justice. And however, what was happening on the inside of the COP, same things, fancy speeches, promises, commitments, pledges, and a certain kind of celebration in the halls showing that we were on the road to success. But then a recent climate report showed that we are on a 2.4 degree pathway. And that is a death sentence for so many communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. Even 1.5 is still not safe. At just 1.2 degrees, communities in the global south are suffering some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So to know that we are on the pathway of 2.4 degrees Celsius, it is very devastating, it is very frustrating. And again, that shows that commitments will not reduce emissions. Promises will not stop the suffering of people. Pledges will not stop our planet from warming. That's why it's really important to listen to the people on the streets, the people who are advocating and demanding for climate justice, because we know what is happening on the ground. As everyone thinks that 1.5 will be the safest thing for all of us, people should know that even right now at 1.2, it is still dangerous for so many communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. But while the global south is on the front lines of the climate crisis, it is not on the front pages of the world's newspapers. Many activists in the global south faced a challenge, first of all, going to the COP because of the funding, because of accreditation, because of vaccination, because of visas, all these challenges. So how shall we have climate justice if the people on the front lines of the climate crisis are left out of these conferences, are not platformed, are not amplified, find themselves cropped out, are not allowed in certain rooms? We won't be able to have climate justice if not every person or every community is included in these spaces. Every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. So I think it's really important to listen to the stories of the people from the most affected areas.
Right, thank you. And I think, you know, as a follow-up, when that really terrible incident happened with the AP where you were cropped out of a photo, you remarked that basically they had erased your entire continent, which is awful. And so I wonder, when eyes are consistently turned to rich nations like the US and China and what the agreements are going to be and the progress that was made, how do you make people face the urgency of countries that they have forgotten about?
I personally, every platform I get to speak at, be it a panel, be it a speech, be it an interview, I always use those little moments of that I've been given to speak, to talk about the experiences of the people in my community, people across the African continent, people in the global south, and to consistently remind people that the climate crisis is a present reality. It is something that is happening right now, something that is not coming, in the far future. So I think that every moment I get to speak or to use my voice, I just talk about how we may all be facing the same storm of the climate crisis, but we are in different boats. Some boats are way weaker. Some boats are already sinking. Some boats are already on fire. And the boats that seem to be very strong are excited about us limiting global temperatures to 1.5, and yet it's already terrible. So every opportunity I get or on social media, I just use those moments to talk about. It's up to the media or it's up to any other person to help amplify what I'm saying or what any other activist from the global south is saying.
Lily, I'm going to be a bit tough with you now. So I think that in many ways, higher institutions of learning are by design shielded from the realities of the world outside. I think of the ivory tower. Maybe that's old-fashioned, and if it is, you need to correct me. I'd like to know what your university, Singapore Management University, what your role is in specifically looking outward to address the realities of a world we actually live in.
Thank you for that opportunity. I feel I must push back in the sense that educational institutions, yes, indeed, there are those that are ivory towers, that are inward looking, and that are caught in their own worlds of research and publication, and speaking from one intellectual to another without necessarily a care of what's actually happening in the real world, so to speak. But there are educational institutions, and I count mine amongst them, where the real impact is not the impact factor of a journal which we publish in. The real impact is the difference that we can make to the communities around us. And that difference can be made in a variety of ways. There's no greater impact that we can make than through education, because if we educate our students well, and if they have that sense of mission, they will amplify what it is they have learned and take that into the world and make a difference. There is no better amplification that we can have than through research that can actually be adopted by business, by government and society, that can make a difference. And there is no greater impact than if we support and encourage and mentor young men and women in activities like entrepreneurial activities, because their inventions, their innovations, their entrepreneurialism can actually bring to the world solutions. I cite just some examples of the sorts of startups that we have incubated at the Singapore Management University, some of them by women, young women entrepreneurs. And we have an alum by the name of Vanessa as well, who was in 2017 listed amongst the Forbes 30 under 30. But what she was doing was to actually develop menstrual cups made of medical grade silicone that are reusable for up to 10 years. It reduces waste, it creates a more economical solution to what women need. It is more practical for women across the globe who have no access to any other forms of sanitation during their monthly periods. They have been working on their project with NGOs in India and Uganda so that women have access to the innovation that they came up with. We have another alum who's worked on something called crunch cutlery, producing edible cutlery, so that at the end of the day, after eating your food, you eat your cutlery as well. In Singapore, and I'm ashamed to say this, but in Singapore, we throw away 500 million disposable cutlery items per year. These edible utensils, packed with flaxseed, with chia seeds, with whole wheat, not only give you that boost of omega-3 and vitamin B3, they help in terms of a much more sustainable future. And we have given our support, our mentorship, our guidance to these young entrepreneurs who have a mission to amplify the effect of their education and their learning beyond the institution. So I do agree with you that there is a tendency sometimes for educational institutions to be ivory towers, to be caught up in our own worlds of intellectual discourse. But at the same time, I think there is hope when our education is seeking to amplify the positive impact, when our research is seeking to do that, and when our engagement with the community is directed in those ways as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we all need to get some crunch cutlery. That sounds spectacular. I'm going to ask one more question, Kate, of you, and then we'll go to our final quick action question at the end. So, Kate, I really wanted to just focus on the children specifically. One of the key principles of the foundation that you run, if I'm not mistaken, is to support children. But I'd love to hear from you how we look at the young, and it can be very young, not just as vulnerable and voiceless, but as meaningful participants in our future. How do we prep them from a very young age to serve our planet?
Yeah, it's an important question. I've got two little boys, aged 7 and 9, and they've grown up in what I would describe as a dual climate household, because my husband's an environmental lawyer. So they've been bombarded, they've been taken on demonstrations and school strikes and a whole bunch of other things from a very young age. So I think a really important role for parents is understanding where their kids are at and providing them age appropriate but not frightening information about the climate crisis, giving them a sense of agency, talking to them about what you're trying to do as a parent, what you're trying to do in your workplace, and answering their questions very honestly. I don't believe on sugarcoating things for children, but you can convey factual information without being frightening about it. So I think all young people today are very, very anxious about their futures. And for my children, it's not even a fraction of the insecurity that are felt by other children around the world. And yet they know something is amiss and they have a responsibility to make it different. So I think how adults interact with children is crucial. I think when it comes to adolescence, what enabled me to continue with my climate activism was, again, the fact that my parents and some of my teachers, not all of them, let's be clear, but some of them were extremely encouraging and listened and said, you have a voice, you should use it. And that has given me immense joy in my life to have that sense of purpose and to have had that reinforced. And again, that's not the experience of most children, and it's certainly not the experience of most girls whose choices are taken away from them. They don't have access to bodily autonomy, sexual reproductive health and rights. They don't choose whether they're in school or out of school. They don't choose whether they have to collect water or whether they're allowed to do their homework. And if they do make it through school, many of them don't get to choose their profession. And I've met many young women who've studied medicine and then societal expectations have taken them out of the workplace. Wasted doctors and nurses and engineers who would love to be in the workplace, but it's not what's expected of them. So I think there is a really important role for all of us in the way that we engage with young people. I remember being a 20-something climate activist and sitting in rooms full of basically elderly white men who were all electrical engineers who told me renewable energy will never work. It will never be cheaper than fossil fuels. The lights will go off. And they were all wrong. So I think it's really important for us to understand that things can change. And young people, through sheer force of will and determination and imagination, can make the world different. And I think for many adults, it is up to us not to put the burden on young people, because young people don't have the power. We have the power as older people, as middle-aged people. We're in positions of influence. But we have a responsibility to create space for them and to understand their ambitions and to create space for their ideas and recognize that we might be wrong, that they may have a better vision than us. And so for me, there are lots of practical things we can do around improving children's nutrition, giving them access to sexual reproductive health and rights and all of those things. But even when children have all of those benefits and are able to go to school, if we don't listen to them and we don't make space for them, we're not going to solve this problem. And that is doubly true of girls and women.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. It was an amazing panel. I'm so grateful to all of you in all your various locations and here with me on the stage. Thank you very, very much. We are concluded.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you to all our amazing